Narratives and binary limitations. Transgender experiences highlight the limitations of binary gender and sexuality classifications. These perspectives are often absent in feminist and lesbian gay theories. The feminist theorization has debated that whether gender or sexuality shapes societal relations, often collapsing the two categories. Different feminist approaches have either prioritized gender over sexuality or vice versa. Some feminists argue for distinguishing between gender and sexuality while acknowledging their interrelation. Queer theory. The queer theory challenges binary models of gender and sexuality, advocating for their separation for better understanding their dynamics. It critiques the naturalization of sex and emphasizes the cultural production of power. Naturalization of sex and emphasizes the cultural production of power. Intersectionality reveals how different forms of oppression, such as class, race, gender, interrelate. Sexuality has often been overlooked in intersectional studies, though it plays a crucial role. The lived experiences of transgender individuals. Historical and ongoing conflation of gender diversity with sexual deviance persists. Medical perspectives often presume a heterosexual outcome of post-transition, reinforcing traditional gender norms. Now, trans men in India face a lot of invisibility and exclusion from societal recognition and government policies. Queering intersectionality. Trans individuals challenge heteropatriarchal norms but face intense vulnerability due to their public gender identity. Trans men in India are particularly marginalized, often confined to domestic spaces and economically dispossessed. Solidarities and exclusions in the LGBTQ+ community. Within the LGBTQ+ community, cisgender gay men often hold power, followed by lesbians, with transgender individuals marginalized. Trans individuals are often excluded from political agendas and only included in visibility-focused events. Transversive solidarities. Transversal politics, inspired by Ambedkar's deliberative democracy, advocates for inclusive and transformative dialogue between marginalized groups and broader social movements. Empathetic coalitional politics can help advance the interests of marginalized groups through shared visions of social transformation. Intersectionality as the burden of minority. 1980s and 1990s feminist thought. Black and third world feminist work gained visibility, but white feminists often avoided addressing the challenges these perspectives posed. White feminist reluctance. Intersectionality as the burden of minority. Now, the reluctance is sometimes justified as avoiding appropriation of voices, but it ultimately shifts the responsibilities of addressing racism onto the black feminists. Post-Orientalism studies focus on colonial domination, neglects uh, pre-colonial caste, gender, and class domination. Indian feminist scholarship often overlooks contributions of women in non-Brahmin movements, which leads to the marginalization of Dalit women's voices. Feminist theorization and difference. 1970s feminism developed a focus on categories like womanhood, experience, and personal politics, which often led to exclusions based on race, class, and ethnicity. Theoretical positions. Feminism emphasized personal politics and the universality of womanhood, but this excluded black women and shifted focus away from critiques of capitalism and the state. Debates on patriarchy, discussions centered around patriarchy's material base and persistence, with black women structurally excluded from these conversations. Socialist feminism, women's oppression. Feminist scholars debated the foundational cause of women's oppression but shifted focus towards difference and away from political economy. Emphasized feminism's right to describe women, but this reinforced traditional gender roles. Feminists began celebrating different voices among women without analyzing underlying structures of oppression like racism and capitalism. while naming differences was important for Black and Third World women, focusing solely on difference limited feminist politics. Third difference, non-Brahmin historiography, emphasizes the lower caste movements that challenge colonial nationalism but are often ignored in dominant historical narratives. Ambedkarite movements, Dalit women's involvement in Ambedkarite movements counters nationalist narratives, yet their contributions are often marginalized. Fulle's liberation project, Jyotiba Phule's advocacy for the lower castes and women highlights non-Brahmin challenges to Brahminical patriarchy. Dalit feminist writings, figures like Muktabai, Savitribai Phule, and Tarabai Shinde critiqued caste-based gender oppression from within their traditions. Silencing political resolutions. The 1931 INC Indian National Congress resolution on women's rights ignored competing political visions, silencing the non-Brahmin perspectives. New social movements. While some 1970s and 1980s movements included Dalit women centrally, others like the Dalit Panthers and the women's movement marginalized the women, the Dalit women specifically. Class versus patriarchy debates fail to address Brahmanism, leaving caste issues unaddressed. The unseen violence and activism. Caste and gender violence. Dalit women face public violence while upper caste women experience private forms of control. Feminist discourse often overlooks caste in its analysis of violence. Backlash against Dalit women. Increased visibility of Dalit women in power has led to violent backlash, often culminating in sexual assault. Brahminical social order intersects caste, labor and gender divisions, justifying the oppression of low caste women through control of their sexuality. Dalit feminist standpoint. Emancipatory potential, complex and contradictory, autonomous Dalit women's organizations and lack of continued debate. Emancipatory potential focuses on lived experiences within socially constructed groups and examines how caste, class, and gender intersect. Recognizes that Dalit women are not a homogeneous group, emphasizing the need for a multidimensional analysis. Emerged in the 1990s, challenging both feminist and Dalit movements for their exclusionary practices. After initial debates, there has been silence on revisiting feminist politics to include caste, suggesting a superficial acceptance of difference without deeper integration. What major shift occurred in feminist thought during the 1980s and 90s? The increased visibility of the Black and Third World feminist work challenged the dominance of white feminist perspectives. Why have white feminists been reluctant to engage with Black and Third World feminist challenges? Therefore, they often avoid appropriation but also shift the responsibility of addressing racism onto the Black feminists. What's overlooked in post-Orientalism studies according to the text? Pre-colonial roots of caste, gender, and class domination. How has Indian feminist scholarship marginalized Dalit women's voices? Indian feminist scholarship, by overlooking their contributions in the non-Brahmin movements and viewing Dalit women's recent assertions as a different voice, what key categories did 1970s feminism focus on, and how did this lead to exclusions? Categories like womanhood, experience, and personal politics led to exclusions around race, class, and ethnicity. What debates emerged in feminist theory regarding patriarchy? Discussion centered on patriarchy's material base and persistence, often excluding black women. How did socialist feminists differ in their understanding of women's oppression? They debated that the foundational causes they debated the foundational causes, but eventually focused on difference, moving away from political economy. What is cultural feminism, and how did that impact feminist discourse? The cultural feminism emphasized feminism's right to define women reinforcing traditional gender roles without challenging them. What is nominalism in feminist theory? The idea that women is a fictitious category because there are differences that construct women differently. How did feminists begin to view differences among women in the late 20th century? They celebrated differences but often failed to analyze the structures that turn differences into oppression. What is the significance of non-Brahmin historiography in feminist theory? Highlights the anti-hierarchical movements that challenge colonial narratives but are often ignored. What contributions did Jyotiba Phule make to the feminist discourse? He challenged Brahminical patriarchy and advocated for the liberation of lower castes and women. How did the Dalit women participate in the Ambedkarite movement? They actively engaged in protests and challenged Brahminical practices linking caste and gender subordination. What impact did the 1931 INC resolution have on women's rights? It silenced non-Brahmin perspectives and flattened competing political visions. How did new social movements of the 1970s and 80s treat Dalit women? Some movements included them centrally, while others, like the Dalit Panthers, marginalized the Dalit women. What debates emerged around class and patriarchy in feminist theory? Debates focused on class versus patriarchy, but often ignored caste issues. How does caste influence gender violence according to the text? Caste determines the forms of violence women face, with Dalit women experiencing public threats and upper caste women facing private control. What backlash have Dalit women faced due to increased visibility? Violent backlash, including sexual assault, often as a means to undermining their social standing. What is Dalit feminist standpoint? It focuses on the lived experiences of Dalit women and the intersection of class and gender. What challenges have autonomous Dalit women organizations faced? They have challenged both feminist and Dalit movements for their exclusionary practices, but faced a lack of sustained debate and preparation. Now, a significant shift in the feminist thought of the 1980s and 90s was the increasing visibility of Black and Third World feminist work. Yet there has been a reluctance on part of the white feminists to confront the challenges posed to them by Black and Third World feminism. Often this reluctance has been justified in terms of white feminists refraining from an appropriation of the voices of Black and Third World women. This reluctance and relative silence on part of the white feminists amounts to an assumption that confronting racism is the sole responsibility of black feminists, or to a reassertion of the old assumption that the political process of becoming anti-sexist includes by definition the process of becoming anti-racist. In the framework of post-Orientalism studies, the focus remains on colonial domination alone. Thereby, the pre-colonial roots of caste, gender, and class domination come to be ignored. Indian feminist scholarship completely overlooks the contributions and interventions of the women in the non-Brahmin movement. The invisibility of this lineage has led scholars to conceive the recent autonomous assertions by Dalit women as a different voice. Post-Orientalism studies focus remains on colonial domination alone. Feminist theorization and differences. Feminism of the 1970s had developed difference from the left. Crucial to this difference were three categories vis-a-vis women, experience, and personal politics, which were central to feminist theorization. The category woman was conceived as collectively their being oppressed by the fact of their womanhood. The three categories just are deployed in combination, and this often led to exclusions around race, class, ethnicity. The ambivalence of the left towards the notion of women's issues was thus countered by an assertion that women were essentially connected with other women, and subjective experiences of knowledge became the base of the universal experiences of womanhood. Thus, experience became base for personal politics as well as only reliable mythological tool for defining oppression. At least three major postulates emerged from such an epistemological position. One, that there is system of male domination, that this system is political, and that politics included are power relationships regardless of whether or not that power operated in the public sphere. That is to say that the personal was declared to political, and as focus came to be on power in intimate relationships. Critiques of state or capitalism took a back seat. In such a theoretical position, black women come to be excluded as a structural consequence of the deployment of the categories of woman, and subjective experience. Theoretical debates came to center around the theme of patriarchy, its material base, its persistence across modes of production, and different levels within modes of production. Socialist feminist: the crux of differences between them rested on their differential conceptualization of the causes of women's oppression. Yet there was a consensus between them in that they believed in the search for fundamentals of social causation. Both the camps asked the question, what is the original or founding cause of women's oppression? But by the 1980s, this consensus had broken up and difference came to the center of feminist analysis. This has meant a focus on language, culture, and discourse to the exclusion of political economy, a rejection of universalism in favor of difference, and insistence on fluid and fragmented human subject rather than collectivities, a celebration of the marginal and denial of the all-casual analysis. The enormous and continued political interrogation of white, middle-class feminism by black and third-world feminists was welcomed and had a tone level led to micro-level analyses of the, the complex interplay of different axes of inequality. This is meant broadly taking one of the following two positions: position of cultural feminism, which sees feminists as having the exclusive right describe and evaluate women. Therefore, passivity comes to mean peaceful, sentimentality means nurture, etc. To say the very defining of a woman is not challenged only by the dominant male definitions of the same come to be challenged. The notion of difference, using the category of difference, feminists came to celebrate the aspects of femininity that were previously looked down upon, or the different voices of women of different nationalities, races, classes, etc. came to be celebrated. Their plurality is underlined without as analysis of the structures of racism, patriarchy's international division of labor and capitalism. Therefore, all analysis come to focus on identities, subjectivities, and representations. The notion of difference did play a significant role in Black and Third World women naming their oppression, but as an analytical and political tool, its value is limited. A shift of focus from naming difference or different voice to social relations that convert difference into oppression is imperative for feminist politics. This requires the working out of the cultural and material dimensions of the interactions and interfaces between the different hierarchies of class, gender, race, and so on. Dalit difference. In fact, these histories have often faced the penalty of being labeled as collaborative and have therefore been ignored in a historiography which is dominated by narratives of nationalism. Jyotiba Phule's project for the liberation of Shudras, Ati-Shudras and women from the slavery of Brahmanism, he conceptualized a Bali Rajya of equality of all men in opposition to Ram Rajya based on Varna Ashrama Dharma, thus reversing the Aryan theory and giving a liberatory vision of history. His, his contestation of Brahminical patriarchy stands in contestation with the recasting of patriarchies by upper caste Brahminical male reformers. His recognition of the material and sexual consequences of enforced widowhood is apparent in the reformist work done by him. Liberation of Shudras, Dalits and women from the slavery of Brahmanism. Muktabai, a student in Phule School, in an essay entitled "About the Girls of Mangs and Mahars", draws attention to the deprivation of lower castes from their lands, the prohibition of knowledge imposed on them, and the complex hierarchies wherein even the lower castes were stratified into more or less polluted. Savitribai Phule's letters reveal an acute consciousness of the relationship between knowledge and power, and crucial need for democratic access to knowledge for the Shudras and women. Tarabai Shinde's "Stree Purush Talna", a text against women's subordination, was written from within the Satyashodak tradition. The early decades of the 20th century saw protests by Muralis against caste-based prostitution in the campaigns launched by Shivram Janoba Kamble. Dalit women delegates passed resolutions against child marriage, enforced widowhood and dowry, critiquing these practices as Brahminity. Against child marriage, enforced widowhood and dowry. Enforced widowhood and dowry. Hmm. Brahminical practices. Women's participation in the MS Mahad Satyagraha, their support to the Independent Labour Party and the Scheduled Caste Federation have been well documented. Women's participation in the Ambedkarite movement must be read in the context. There's also a theory of the origins of subordination of women, and that the same two issues are are intrinsically linked. Okay, dowry deaths and violent controls and regulations on the mobility and sexuality by the family are frequent among the dominant upper castes. Dalit women are more likely to face the collective and public threat of rape, sexual assault, and even physical violence at the workplace and in public. Encapsulation of the Muslim and Christian women within the questions of talaq and divorce. The relative absence of caste as a category in the feminist discourse on violence has led to the encapsulation of Muslim and Christian women within the questions of talaq and divorce. It is clear that while the left party-based women's organizations collapsed caste into class, the autonomous women's groups collapsed caste into sisterhood, both leaving Brahmanism unchallenged. In the anti-Mandal protests, young middle-class women declared that they were against all kinds of reservations, including those for women, and they mourned the death of merit and explicated that they were out to save the nation. Their placards said, "We want employed husbands." Sexuality and caste became hidden issues as they protested as citizens, not as women. The increasing visibility of Dalit women in power structures as sarpanch or member of the panchayat and in the new knowledge-making processes such as Banwari Devi's intervention through the Sathan program has led to increased backlash against the Dalit women. The backlash is expressed through a range of humiliating practices and often culminates in rape or hacking to death of their kinsmen. Kannabiran and Kannaviran have pointed to how the deadlock between Kshatriya and Dalit men, caused by Dalit agricultural labourer women dressing well, could be solved only by a decision taken by men of both communities. It was decided that women of either community would not be allowed to step into each other's locations. The sexual assault on Dalit women has been used as a common practice for undermining the manhood of the caste. Some Dalit male activists did argue that in passing derogatory remarks about upper caste girls, Dalit men were only getting their own back. In the Brahminical social order, caste-based division of labor and sexual divisions of labor are intermeshed such that elevation in caste status is preceded by the withdrawal of women of that caste from productive processes outside the private sphere. Such a linkage derives from presumptions about the accessibility of sexuality of lower caste women because of their participation in social labor. Brahmanism in turn locates this as a failure of lower caste men to control the sexuality of their women and underlines this as a justification of their impurity. Thus, gender ideology legitimizes not only structures of patriarchy but also the very organization of caste. Hence, caste determines the division of labor, sexual division of labor, and division of sexual labor. Hence, there exist multiple patriarchies, and many of their overlaps and differences are structural. Dalit feminist standpoint. A Dalit feminist standpoint is seen as emancipatory since the subject of its knowledge is embodied and visible. The thought begins from the lives of Dalit women, and these lives are present and visible in the results of the thought. It places emphasis on individual experiences within socially constructed groups and focuses on the hierarchical, multiple changing structural power relations of caste, class, ethnic, which construct such a group. It's obvious that the subject agent of Dalit women's standpoint is multiple, heterogeneous, even contradictory, that is, the category of Dalit women is not homogeneous. Such a recognition underlines the fact that the subject of Dalit feminist liberatory knowledge must also be subject to every other liberatory project, and this requires a sharp focus on the processes by which gender, race, class, caste, sexuality all construct each other. Thus, we agree that Dalit feminist standpoint itself is open to liberatory interrogations and revisions. So it's basically emancipatory since the subject of its knowledge is involved and visible. The early 1990s saw the assertion of autonomous Dalit women's organizations at both the regional and national levels. Such an assertion had thrown up several crucial theoretical and political challenges, besides underlining the Brahmanism of the feminist movement and the patriarchal practices of Dalit politics. The formation of autonomous Dalit women's organizations initially propelled a serious debate, drawing responses from both left party-based as well as autonomous women's organizations. However, the debates seem to have come to rest, and the relative silence and the apparent absence of a revisioning of feminist politics thereafter only suggests an ideological position of multiple plural feminist standpoints. That to say, the separate assertion by Dalit women's organizations comes to be accepted as one more standpoint, and within such a framework of reference, issues of caste become the sole responsibility of Dalit women's organizations. Crenshaw.